Again, appreciate all the sponsors powering the conference. We've got Inside Tracker. So any questions, please send out to Jonathan. You guys will be receiving the emails with the discount code. So like I mentioned before, always great to be partnering with sponsors who I've used myself over the years. We've got ProBio Nutrition, Athlete, the first all-in-one for athletes. So look out for some discount codes there. And of course, teeing up today's talk, we've got OmegaQuant. Again, another great testing and product I've used with teams, I've used with athletes, and used myself over the years. And Tavis always been a great source of information. And so I'm looking forward to the talk here today. Tavis, how you doing?
Good, sir. How are you, Mark? It's good to be here.
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I appreciate you carving out some time and looking forward to diving into all things omega-3 and cognition and performance. So what I will do here is I'm going to make you the host, and then you should be able to share your screen. We'll kick things off. And again, any new folks joining in, the questions will use the chat function, and then I'll help to moderate those at the end of the session. So as the talk's going on, please use the chat, pop your questions in there, and I'll be able to go through those at the end with Tavis to make sure you get all your questions answered. All right, Tavis, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time. Just a little bit about my background. I've been a sports dietitian for 23 years, previously spent some time in collegiate sports between Tulane University for the most part for about 14 years, from 2002 to 2016, the New Orleans Saints from 06 to 2013, and the New Orleans Hornets and Pelicans from 06 to 2013 as well. So previously, looking at omega-3 and the versatility, now my role is I oversee our sales team at OmegaQuant, work a lot with our sports and sports RDs to bring testing to the athletic performance space. So I'm going to go through a lot of information in a short period of time. So I'm going to try not to go too fast, but I want to make sure I get all the research in. What's omega-3? These are essential fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and really three critical ones. EPA and DHA are the most important that we'll talk about, particularly DHA today, especially around the brain health side. Found mostly going to be in marine sources or algae and krill. Those are really your three primary sources. ALA is the plant-based, so whether you consume certain types of leafy vegetables, flax, chia, walnut, even things like soybean oils, which get, kind of the seed oil world, they do contain ALA. But the problem is plant-based omega-3s are not very effective when especially converting to EPA and DHA, and they will not increase your omega-3 score. So if we're looking at the best sources of omega-3 and marine sources, it's going to be these types of fish that are listed here, particularly things like the herring, the wild salmon, that you'll get 3 ounces will give you a good somewhere between 15 and 1800 milligrams of EPA. And then what do standard over-the-counter supplements provide? I'll talk about that at the end and what's critical about the form of omega-3 that's being used. But most standard over-the-counter things that we get in stores like a pharmacy or a grocery are going to be in ethyl ester form, which is the processed version of the oil, but also it's going to be in a pretty low dose. Today, I'm going to talk about a couple of key areas and where omega-3s are beneficial, the cardiovascular side, but we'll focus more on the lean muscle growth, some new studies that have come out on that, inflammatory, and obviously the nutritional support for concussion and TBI. And, as Mark mentioned, OmegaQuant, we are the inventors of the omega-3 test, invented by Dr. Bill Harris. He's just a fatty acid scientist. He invented a way to test the blood for omega-3 in 04, opened OmegaQuant in 09. And what makes our test a little bit unique is the fact that we test the whole blood red blood cell. So we're looking at this over 4 months. We're like an A1C, but a little bit longer. A blood draw will test the plasma. That's an acute marker, 24-hour status. You have to be fasted, and you have to remove omega-3. You do not have to be fasted when using the dried blood spot that measures the whole blood red blood cell. So it's used quite extensively in a lot of collegiate and professional settings. It's a good predictor of CVD and sudden cardiac death. I'll talk about that. And also, we look at the baseline of optimal ranges between 8 and 12%. 90% of people are going to be in that 4 to 5% range. So this is a pretty big, if not the world's biggest nutrient deficiency. 80% of the globe have low to suboptimal levels of omega-3. When you look at where the US and Canada usually fall somewhere in that 4 to 5, 5.5% range, vegans and US military are in that 1.5 to 3. That's because plant-based omega-3s will not increase your score. You have to get that through algae if you're a vegan or vegetarian. The military just doesn't have enough in the food supply. And you look at countries that have high ranges. Now, the 8 to 12% was initially around Dr. Harris's work on cardiovascular disease. And he saw 35 to 40% reduction in risk in coronary heart disease when you got to 8%. and about an 80 to 90% reduction in sudden cardiac death and primary heart attack just by getting to 6 and 7%. So this is a pretty important mark. And we have a lot of more studies over the years to look at a lot of different things. And I'm going to cover some key data today, particularly on the performance side, and as well as a new study that was out. This is just a study that was the first one done by a team of colleagues, as well as athletic trainers and others, looking at omega-3 scores in athletes at the collegiate level. Every athlete, none of those athletes that were used in this study, all 266 had, or actually it was about 300 athletes did not have a score that was in the optimal range. So somewhere in that intermediate range, and about 34% with the high risk, less than 4%. Then a follow-up study by John at Gatorade and his group looked at NBA G League athletes, and all of the athletes but one player had a low score. And this has been replicated a couple of other times now that we see athletes are pretty much following the same trend in adults. So the first area I want to cover today is brain health. What's important here? Because our brain is made up of fatty acids. All those bars in white are omega-3 fats. DHA is the most important. You can see 25% of the brain fatty acid composition is made up of DHA. So that's why it's such a critical nutrient that we have high levels in the blood. And we'll talk about that. And then also arachidonic acid. All the black bars are omega-6 fats. Linoleic acid and arachidonic are probably the most commonly known. If we have way too much arachidonic, then yeah, it's a little bit highly inflammatory. But omega-6 is not all bad. I mean, we hear seed oils are bad, and that's really not the problem in today's society. There's a lot of demonization of omega-6, but the biggest problem is omega-3 deficiency. If we would just correct the omega-3 deficiency, we would not have an issue with the 6-to-3 ratio. When we look at brain injury, there's a lot of things that happen. That's why one of the critical nutrients outside of omega-3 is creatine, because when you have any type of severe head trauma like this or any type of collision, it also depletes the brain of ATP. Brain creatine levels also drop. Same thing with omega-3 levels. DHA supplementation and high levels in the brain provide a lot of neuroprotection. But there's a high calcium influx, cell death, apoptosis, and a lot of different things happen in those neurons. DHA comes in as a neuroprotective nutrient, and the fact that it provides an anti-apoptotic effect. It's also anti-inflammatory, so it's really working to help promote neuroinflammation. But it's really has been a form of treatment in the past when we look at using therapy to either mitigate or treat concussion. So when we look at omega-3 fatty acids, it's to promote neuronal cell survival, also reduce the cell death, cannot prevent it completely, but we can reduce the severity of it. It also helps reduce oxidative stress, gives the brain more plasticity, it increases neurotransmission. When we look at just the incidence of concussion, right, we focus a lot on pro sports, but a lot of this really where the attention needs to be is the high school athlete, particularly in certain sports. If you look at, I think high school football has about 8 million participants. You look at the number of concussions. Now, the NFL data is a little bit different. I'm going to show a little bit more recent data that we have. But when we look at different sports that are high incidence on the head injury, things like even wrestling doesn't get too much attention, or martial arts, cheerleading. When you look at the risk, football, track and field, which you might not really think like, where is that going to happen, right? And certain other sports like softball and basketball, this is in the pediatric level of youth sports. And then if we look at certain positions, we would think interior linemen, offense, defense would have the higher incidence, but running backs, obviously, who have a lot of more speed, especially after they, get a ball, are going to have collision with someone, whether in the interior line or linebacker in the secondary, and they use their head a pretty good bit as part of a lead component of their force. So not all positions. LSU's got some really good blood data that came out on interior linemen as well as certain positions to show different markers of head injury outside of neurofilament light, which was recently published. So if we look at the NFL concussion data, it's gotten a lot better. I mean, at least now that we have someone on the sideline that's not associated with the team, we have some good information to where we can get more assistance for those athletes. But we've seen some improvement in those outcomes in that data. So the current treatment has been, for quite a long time, removed from play, right? Get physical rest, progressive turn or replay, medications. Nothing truly would address the brain itself. Nothing would truly focus on reducing inflammation in the brain, providing neuroprotection. So then Julian Bales many years ago started looking at things and started being a little bit different in regards to their approach. This was an incident in a mining accident where there were 14 trap miners, 13 of them passed away. There was one lone survivor who had respiratory distress, lung collapse, unresponsive. Then they gave them a high dose of omega-3 through a peg tube, somewhere in the 15, 16 grams, if I recall correctly. And they had a complete recovery. So this was like one of the first incidences of like, let's look at a different approach, right? Because a lot of times we'll see people get in car accidents and, be in a vegetative state or have complete brain damage. And those were things that were actually happened. And Julian Bales was also involved in this incident. So this was a teenager with a severe TBI. And what they did was they had a Glasgow coma score of 3, so pretty much deep unconsciousness, subdural and small temporal hematoma in the brain. And then they were believed to be in the vegetative state, placed on a trach and peg tube, started enteral feedings, was not given the weekend to live. They said, let's try something, that we've tried before, 16.4 grams of combined EPA and DHA. And then within 3 days later, weaned off a ventilator. Now, in speaking with Dr. Bales and others that have tried these, it doesn't work every single time, but it was a way to start looking at something a little bit different. Then in the professional space, neurofilament light became one of those key markers that started being examined. It's an intermediate fiber in neurons in the axonal skeleton. When elevated, it shows markers of brain injury. Unsure of the mechanism of release, but we do know there are significant changes in neurofilament light as a result of injury. We've seen elevations in different sports, particularly boxing, in the cerebral spinal fluid increase, as well as neurofilament light, those that are having complete continuous concussion and subconcussion head impacts, as well as in collegiate and professional sports. And we know nutritional support with EPA and DHA will not work for every injured person, but it's shown to be promising. This was the first study by John Oliver, I think in 2016, that really looked at, let's look at the entire course of a college football season and see the different effects. So they basically took and looked at the effects of just DHA by itself on neurofilament light. 81 Division I athletes, football players, that took 2, 4, and 6 grams of DHA, pretty high dose, or placebo, and they looked at them over the course of 189 days of their entire season. This was starters versus non-starters. So this was just changes in neurofilament light, which is expected. Those that are going to get a lot more play in time, who have a lot more practice, a lot more contact with the head, are going to see a significant rise in neurofilament light. So that's expected. This was the treatment group versus the placebo. So you can see, even though those who received DHA, and this is all groups combined, saw an increase, the DHA supplementation mitigated that rise, especially towards the end of the season. Neurofilament light was significantly higher than those that did not get DHA. What was interesting, though, is the 2-gram serving had the most significant impact at mitigating the rise in neurofilament light. So it was thought of that high doses of omega-3 was needed. Maybe at a severe TBI level, that is true, but at least in some of these micro traumas that happen, every single practice, every game, maybe that might not be true. So that study was followed up by Jeff Heilson, and you'll see his name a lot. And he really looked at a couple of different things. He used the same protocol with DHA. He said, I'm going to take the same amount of DHA, but we're going to add a little bit of EPA and DPA. So when you see other omega-3 in a fish oil or a product, 90% of the time that's going to be DPA, unless they add omega-6, which you do see. So 2 grams of DHA, a little bit of EPA. They looked at 2 different football teams. He also added other markers. So he looked at neurofilament light, he looked at omega-3 index, and he looked at markers of inflammation. Obviously, in the supplemental group, omega-3 is going to increase. That's going to be normal. If you're using a high-quality oil in a good dose, your omega-3 levels will go up. Same thing in all subjects, the same type of change in baseline neurofilament light in the group that did not get that got corn oil or did not get omega-3 saw a significant increase from baseline, and those that did receive omega-3 saw a small increase, but it really mitigated that rise. And then starters, just looking at starters, not versus non-starters, you can see from trial 2 to 3 a pretty big increase, but then it leveled off. It went up again towards the end of the season, but it was a significant difference between the control and the omega-3 group. So another study that showed the effect of EPA in mitigating the rise. So what these 2 studies have basically said was, we can't prevent a concussion from happening, but if we get the omega-3 level to a good baseline of, let's say 8, I would recommend 10, 11%. By the start of the season, you're going to have protection. So I tell every colleague or athletic trainer, now's the time to test for any sport in the fall where there's a high incidence of concussion, because you don't want to wait until the concussion happens in order to start providing that omega-3. And this was another study that was done by Ronnie Mullins and a group that looked at a little bit of a different format, but somewhat similar. Pretty high dose of 2,400 milligrams of DHA and 1,100 EPA, but they use it as an ethyl ester. I'll explain that in just a second. And then they also looked at some inflammatory cytokines, looking at NCAA football players, and then a control group of safflower oil. So this was kind of the breakdown. They looked at fatty acids 6 different times throughout the 26 weeks, and then did supplementation throughout. This is kind of a hard little table to look at, or a figure. So this is just looking at omega-3 levels, DHA on the left and EPA. Obviously, the treatment group is going to see an increase in both EPA and DHA with supplementation. But I'll talk about a key data point at the end. Now, on the first side, it's the treatment group looking at neurofilament light. So it really didn't mitigate the rise in neurofilament light compared to placebo. Both had increases. And in some cases, the treatment group had a pretty big increase in neurofilament light. And then we look at some of the other markers that we have here in risk factors and didn't really see any improvements in outcomes. So from this study, and this was looking at omega-3 index. Now, what we found interesting is that none of the athletes reached an omega-3 index of 8%. So what could have possibly been the cause? One, I think, was ethyl ester. So ethyl ester is the processed version of the oil. It's less bioavailable. You have to consume it with food. What we've seen from some internal studies done with college programs is compliance. So we don't know what the compliance was of these athletes, but at the same time, if you're using a lower quality oil and it has to be taken with food, there's a less likely chance. Because typically what we've seen in the research is you need more ethyl ester in order to increase your omega-3 levels in your blood. These individuals not only had lower omega-3 scores, they also started out with very low neurofilament light levels. So they didn't see a big rise. So they were unable to replicate the results from previous studies, possibly due to lower neurofilament light values in the study. And then also due to scheduling issues, blood collection 24 hours post-game was not possible. So why higher doses? Mainly to correct the omega-6 to 3 ratio. In most cases, we're seeing 15 to 20 to 1, which is incredibly high. We want that to be 2 to 3 to 1 would be ideal. People say 1 to 1. That's pretty hard to see. I don't see that often, even with very high doses. But if you get to 2 to 3 to 1, you're really doing a good job of consuming enough omega-3. It also saturates the brain for nutritional support. And it's just a tool to kind of help improve outcomes. It's not a cure, but it does provide nutrients. Now, when we look at performance, Jeff Heilson again looked at the effect of omega-3 in body comp strength and power and strength in collegiate athletes, 27 college athletes. They maintained their training program for 8 weeks, 3 grams of fish oil, more on the EPA side, looked at hand grip strength, power, along with peak power, mean power. They did measure omega-3 index, which, as we will see, you'll see a good increase overall. Lean body mass improves slightly in those 8 weeks, nothing too significant. Fat-free mass stayed about the same. Fat mass went down, 0.1 kilograms. So nothing really drastically significant there. What they did see a significant rise in was hand grip strength. That was the one marker that they showed about an 8 to 9. I think it was about a 9.6 increase in hand grip strength with those on omega-3. Counter movement jumps, a slight increase, but nothing that was considered significant. So overall, the percent change in the whole blood fatty acid was positively correlated with hand grip strength, about 9.1%, but those other markers did not show any of the other outcomes. So when we look at inflammatory, this is another area that, when we speak to colleagues and RDs and different groups about why omega-3, a lot of the focus is so much on concussion, but really the area where we feel it's the most important is in the anti-inflammatory property. So we know EPA and DHA both support cell health, joint comfort, tissue regeneration and generation, but also healthy recovery in the inflammatory response. Just, getting that EPA to DHA of about 2 to 1. EPA is the effective fatty acid that's going to help mitigate inflammation. That's one that's going to be provided for cardiovascular protection, but DHA is also critical. But about 2 grams per day of about 2 to 1, even a 1.5 to 1 EPA to DHA is beneficial in counteracting exercise-induced inflammation. So higher omega-3s, less omega-6s, but really just focusing on increasing omega-3 in the blood will lower the 6 to 3 in the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio. Richard Bloomer did a study several years ago looking at the effect of EPA and DHA on resting and exercise in inflammatory conditions. So what they basically did was they just put someone on a treadmill, climbed them up, put a weighted backpack on them, and just tried to burn out their legs. Gave them a lot of fish oil, about 4.4 grams, equally divided between EPA and DHA, and looked at markers of the inflammatory response. So 6 weeks of supplementation, washout, 6 weeks of supplementation, and looked at markers like C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker if high. You can see the EPA and DHA group had a significant difference from those within 48 hours. And then tumor necrosis factor was also lower in the EPA and DHA group. Another study looked at different doses of omega-3 and fish oil on recovery and soreness from eccentric exercise. So these are 32 college athletes. They supplemented for about 7.5 to 8 weeks, 2 to 4 or 6 grams versus a placebo. And then looked at vertical jump, knee extensor strength, 40-yard sprint, and then the t-test, and also perceived absorbance. So basically, they just did an exhaustive eccentric exercise, did a lot of muscle damage to their legs, and then looked at certain markers. And what was interesting is when we look at the effect of omega-3, obviously the 6-gram dose had a pretty big impact on vertical jump recovery. So if you look at 24 hours and then 48 hours and then 72 hours, still increasing and improving over that course of time. So even in some of the other groups, the 2-gram had a decent response, even a little bit better than the 4-gram response. But overall, all of those supplemented groups improved and outperformed placebo group. If you look at markers of perceived soreness, those that received the highest dose of 6 grams had very little soreness within about 48 to 72 hours, but all groups, even the 2 and the 4, had a better outcome than the placebo. And then if we look at markers of muscle damage, like creatine kinase, which is typically going to be elevated after a highly intense workout, the 6-gram group hardly had any elevation at all. There was an elevation, which is expected from 19.3, that went up to as high as 120 to 150.8 within 24 hours, but then it was right back down 2 or 3 days later. You can see the 4-gram group didn't really have a lot of success there. It started going down a little bit after 24 and 48, but then more, but it was still quietly elevated compared to pre-levels. Same with the 2-gram, not as bad as the 4, and then the placebo was still much higher. Same thing with lactate dehydrogenase, the 6-gram group, which that's a pretty big dose, didn't really see much elevation there and recovered pretty quickly within 3 days. And then this was an older study that also looked at the omega-3 index on performance of inflammation in heavy eccentric training. So basically measuring the marker of omega-3 index, supplemented 2.7 grams, and then they performed a heavy eccentric exercise, looked at bloods of CRP, creatine kinase, and blood lactate over the course of those 3 days, and actually 96 hours after exercise. And those that had a higher omega-3 score had less reported delayed onset muscle soreness. You can see it went up pretty high in the 24 hours in both groups, and then started to recover pretty quickly. It was significant at 72 hours between those groups. When we look at CRP levels, quite high 24 hours in the group that had low omega-3 levels versus high, and then they both returned to pretty close levels within 4 days. And then peak torque was pretty impressive in the group that had higher levels of omega-3. So you can see within 24 hours, those that had a level above 4% had a higher torque that was significant compared to those that were deficient. Now, when we look at muscle growth and regulation, one of the key things from this paper, this was the first paper that mentioned that omega-3 may have anabolic potential. So one of the things they concluded was it may modulate molecular signaling for muscle growth and hypertrophy. It may stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So we know, obviously, protein carbohydrate combined. Maybe omega-3 is something that needs to be included as a post-workout, not only for the anti-inflammatory side, but also for the tissue regeneration or potentially tissue repair. And it may combat sarcopenia in older adults. So I'm going to talk about a study that was done in krill oil coming up. And here's that study. So this was 102 men and women that were average age of 71. So these are not people that typically are known to build muscle. They received 4 grams per day of krill oil. And this is a new paper, I think 2022. And they looked at knee extensor torque, grip strength, muscle mass, and a bunch of other markers, lipids, CRP. And the really cool thing here was maximal torque increased within 6 months. Now, it's a long period of time. We're not expecting older adults to build muscle pretty quickly. Their grip strength went up in the krill group. Overall, if you look at the bottom right, max torque went up about 9%, grip strength went up about 11%, and they increased muscle size. So muscle thickness improved about 3 to 4%, showing that older adults can build muscle, not only with an effective resistance training program, but also with omega-3 supplementation. These are just a couple of newer studies. We're not going to really break them down. It's just showing On the left, higher omega-3 index was associated with more rapid heart rate recovery. So showing, better heartbeats, better heart rate recovery from intense training. Another study by Jeff Heilson in the military looked at the effect of EPA and vitamin D that was associated with Army combat fitness strength, and basically showed that, those increases in omega-3 score was associated with better performance in all different markers of their performance tests in the military. Also, we know athletes can benefit from an increased intake of EPA and DHA. When we look at the outcomes, it's training adaptations, and these are some of the outcomes they've seen in improved cycling and running economy, brain functions, we've talked about those, and recovery support, maintaining muscle mass after injury, better recovery from exercise, reduction in muscle soreness. And then the most recent paper that was just published last week, this is just a new read. I haven't had a chance to go through this entire paper yet, but it's just showing the value of omega-3 as a sport biomarker, right? We look at things like vitamin D and iron and magnesium and certain markers, but this is also a marker now that we feel is an important data point. It can give individuals, it's also an easy data point to correct. Last couple of slides, we'll just kind of talk about what's the most effective way to do that. Number one, through food. I mean, there's no need to supplement if you're eating fish at least probably 4 to 5 days a week. We've seen data to where 3 days a week will get you to about 7%. I'll show you that slide in just a second. But it's also an easy, convenient way to increase omega-3 levels in the blood. Now, we also realize not everybody likes to supplement, and that's okay. But this is a study that looked at 3 days a week would get them to about 7%. If they took that with a supplement, it would get them to about 8%. It's just we need to be consistent. And it's pretty rare that people are going to be eating salmon and herring 3 to 4 days a week. From a protocol for athletes, 2 to 3 grams is typically recommended. There's no concerns with bleeding. If anything, I'd be more concerned with the amount of omega-6s that they're consuming in the clotting side and inflammatory side. So if anything, this is going to improve their outcomes overall. If you look at concussion, now this is from Dr. Mike Lewis, Brain Health Education. He's done a lot of work in this area. This is his recommendation for a concussion protocol, depending on symptoms. Week 1, it's about 9 grams of equal DHA and EPA. Then based on how that athlete feels, we can reduce that to about 6 grams, and then week 3 goes to a maintenance dose. This just shows how much omega-3 is needed to move the index. So if you're going to go from about 4% to about 8%, at least probably starting out at about 1,800 to 2,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA. What the study that we did at our lab with Rachel Walker and their lab, we created an algorithm based on someone's omega-3 score. So you can go to OmegaQuant.com, you can go to the top resources and type in calculator, and based on, you can toggle that between 8 and 12%, and you can put in what that person's score is. And it looks at different types of oil. Ethyl ester, as we mentioned, is the processed version of the oil. It's less bioavailable. You have to take it with food, but it's not good for the gut. That's the one thing, is it's not good for the GI system long-term. Wouldn't recommend it. Triglyceride is what you eat when you eat salmon or you eat herring or sardines. You're eating natural fish. You're getting the natural triglyceride form. And then phospholipid is a krill. So pretty close to triglyceride, which did outperform phospholipid. There are SPMs. The thing is with Dr. Harris is like, if your omega-3 levels are high, your body will produce enough SPM. So there's really no need to take them on top of that. Plus, they're pretty cost prohibitive at about $100 a bottle. But also there's things like monoglycerides, which are fairly new on the market that have shown to be impactful. If someone is vegan or vegetarian, algal or algae oil is the only way to do that. And this is just to kind of show, it's important to show, if something says it's triglyceride form, that's great. But on the back of the label, you want to ensure that, or you want to ask the brand, hey, what percent triglyceride are you? Because not all triglyceride is manufactured the same way. It could range from 50 to 90%. 50 means it's half triglyceride, half ethyl ester, more than likely, because it's a lower cost to the manufacturing or supplement brand. So if something says also pharmaceutical grade, that's just marketing. There's nothing made in a pharmacy. It's all manufactured in a supplement manufacturing facility. So you can see here, this product is saying marine triglyceride 1250. It's only giving you 750 EPA DHA. The other 500 is probably coming from DPA. So on the one on the left, it's 1,500. It gives you 1,400. The 100 milligrams is coming more than likely from DPA, but it's also manufactured greater than 90%. And then most important is obviously certified for sport to ensure your athletes are avoiding, testing positive for a banned substance. All right, I may have gone over, but just last piece. It's just an incredibly versatile nutrient. Like you look at vitamin D, you look at creatine, you look at some of these nutrients. Omega-3 is in that top 3 of some of the most versatile nutrients. We need it every single day it's essential. Our body's not going to make it. We do have some people with genetic conditions where we've seen in the lab levels at 14, 15%, and they're claiming they've never consumed omega-3, which that's rare. But we do need to increase it from food and supplementation to balance those levels. We do need more studies to look at new opportunities in blood, to look at concussion and TBI and different markers, SB100, beta amyloid, tau. We were having some discussions with Jeff and some others about getting some blood from other organizations that have looked at concussive data to measure omega-3 and maybe doing something at the collegiate or high school level. But it should be considered the first nutritional strategy. When you look at athletes in concussion, it's something that can work. Triglyceride fish oil is the best, but anything will work. We just want people consuming, and getting someone's level to 8% should be the primary goal. All right, any questions?